Thanks, Buhle. The Judicial Service Commission last week interviewed several judges nominated to hold positions in several superior courts in the country. Following the interviews, the JSC shortlisted 4 candidates for the ConCourt, namely Judge Fayeeza Kathree Setiloane, Adv Alan Dodson, Judge Mahube, Molemela, and Judge Owen, while Judge David Unterhalter has been cut from that list. Questions about whether his interview process was fair have also been raised. Let's get some insight as we speak to researcher at Judges Matter Mbekezeli Benjamin, who's been following the interviews this past week. A very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. ConCourt candidate David Unterhalter faced a rather unexpected grilling at the JSC interviews. A lot has been spoken of with him being left out again within this process. What have you made of the deliberations?
Good morning, Paul, and good morning to the viewers at home. Well, the JSC's sitting this past week was interesting. I think coming into the sitting, there was a lot of expectation of how the JSC would behave. You'll recall that in the past, the JSC has behaved quite poorly and has come for some criticism, and so there was a lot of expectation that it would have turned a corner, things would have changed, and I think for the most part, the JSC seems to have changed. There are just a few parts that still remain to address. One of them is the rules of procedure. So during Judge David Unterhalter's interview, there was a question that was put to him based on information that he was not provided before the interview. So he said he couldn't respond to it because he didn't have the information in front of him, but he also didn't prepare to answer that question. And so the JSC had to take a break for him to look at the information, for him to be able to answer that question. So that just shows us that the JSC still has not addressed the issue of rules of procedure. But something interesting that came out of last week was that the JSC finally announced that they now are using a set of criteria to assess the candidates, and this was criteria that was from 2010, but they were now sort of reaffirming those criteria, and they applied them throughout the week. And I think for the most part, they were loyal, and they looked at those criteria, and they interrogated the candidates based on those.
Yes, and committing to those written guidelines was also, definitely something that stood out in the process of the interviews. A lot of questions have been asked about the manner in which judges are appointed. A lot of criticism made mention with calls for perhaps a revamp of the entire system, including booting politicians off the Judicial Service Commission. What's your take? Do you think that this would be something that would be effective in the appointment?
Well, we as Judges Matter don't think so. We think that politicians play an important role on the Judicial Service Commission, and the way that the drafters of the Constitution thought of the JSC was that it was supposed to be a body that has different perspectives, different points of views, and they would balance off each other. So there are lawyers, there are judges, there are politicians who are members of parliament on the JSC, and we don't think it is useful to remove such an important category or sector of the JSC. As we saw this week, the politicians were actually asking some of the important questions to the candidates, and they were able to interrogate them on important information. For example, on Friday, Judge Mandondo came for an interview, and he had written a book that, by all accounts, seems to be extremely homophobic. And it was actually a politician, the Speaker of Parliament, who interrogated him thoroughly on that issue, and she made it quite clear that she was not comfortable with a judge holding such views on the bench. And that was an important aspect of the interview that I think would have been lost if it was simply another judge or a lawyer interrogating that issue.
And looking at perhaps some of the other issues that came to the forefront during the interview process, we know that a lot came perhaps on gender roles, transformation. Sexual harassment policy was also a topic that came to the forefront when Judge Hendricks was also questioned about that and the importance of having one. What were some of the other topics that stood out for you when it comes to the level of criteria that is needed for a ConCourt judge?
Well, yes, the aspect of gender came out in different ways. You mentioned the sexual harassment policy, which is an important aspect of helping women stay in the judiciary. Because if you want more women to come in, you need to create a conducive environment for them to stay. And one of them is, we know that in the legal profession there is pervasive sexual harassment. So it is not unexpected that there would be in the judiciary. And so the commissioners were saying we're asking the judicial candidates on whether there is a sexual harassment policy and whether it is enforced and how is it enforced. But another aspect that came out quite strongly was candidates being asked about their contribution towards transformation of the legal profession, because that is one of the ways of expressing the constitutional values that they speak of. And so a lot of the candidates were asked how many junior advocates they assisted to build up their practices, how many junior advocates they assisted in mentoring, in building, in giving them the skills for them to stay in the legal profession. And some of the candidates were able to quite easily respond to those issues, but there were some who struggled, especially the white lawyers who had spent quite a bit of time in the legal profession. One of the main points of Judge Unterhalter's interviews was an interrogation of the list of advocates that he had assisted, including black women. There was really a question on whether or not he had spent sufficient time, and at the level of influence that he had, did he contribute towards making sure that those younger lawyers are able to benefit from his experience and to be given the exposure of the big and complex cases that he had dealt with. So that was also an important aspect of the interviews.
And some criticism also came through what some refer to as an absence of more probing questions around judicial philosophy, how the law was being interpreted in terms of understanding and depth, which could then essentially be a contributing factor to society based on freedom, dignity, and so forth.
Well, yes, we didn't hear a lot this week on questions of judicial philosophy, but I think there were parts of the interviews where there was really an interesting teasing out of what a candidate understands of the role of a judge in society. So at the beginning of the interviews, Chief Justice Zondo would ask the candidates whether they know what the rule of law is, what the separation of powers is, what judicial independence is. And those are key concepts that any judge must understand, because when they're sitting there on the bench, they will be deciding cases that affect not only the law as it applies to the legal profession, for example, but they affect a wider segment of society. You know that our courts have the power to overturn the decisions by parliament, the decisions by government. And that's a huge responsibility, and they must understand where the line of their power is, and that's why it was important for them to be asked about separation of powers. And so part of that was teasing out the candidate's judicial philosophy.
In terms of processes now, candidates have been selected. What happens next?
So what happens now is that there's two different processes that apply for those candidates who were interviewed for the Constitutional Court and those who were interviewed for the other courts. So for the other courts, what happens now is that the JSC's recommended candidates will go to the president, and the president just has to sign and approve those candidates. So the president doesn't have any decision-making power when it comes to the candidates outside of the Constitutional Court. When it comes to the Constitutional Court, though, the president will have to think and decide which candidates he will choose, because the JSC has sent him 4 names and he has to pick one name from that list of 4. And so we still expect the president to spend a bit of time thinking about that. And he also has to consult Parliament, of course, when it comes to the Constitutional Court candidates.
Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion. Researcher at Judges Matter Mbekezeli Benjamin talking about the JSC interview process. Still to come.